All right, so there's actually three things that we're gonna cover. The grazing stick is by far the most in-depth one. That has the most steps for you as a producer. So that's where we're gonna start. We call it a grazing stick. Any big ruler that you would have would get the exact same thing done. A lot of producers really like the grazing stick itself because it's actually a walking stick that has the rulers on it, so it's a little easier just to walk with it through the field. But there's nothing special about it. So if you're saying, "Oh, I can't do this because I don't have a grazing stick exactly," any meter stick would get the exact same thing done. The reason that we use these, it lets us very quickly estimate forage availability, but more importantly to me, it provides a quantitative estimate. You know, we can walk out there and be like, "Oh, that's about 2 days of grazing," or however you want to word it, but this lets us know for sure how much grass is out there and to make those decisions. One way that we're really starting to hopefully use them within our state is to measure grazing loss with respect to drought with some of the FSA programs and stuff like that, to just add that level of quantitativeness to it that we haven't had before. This is going to help you as a producer make stocking decisions by knowing exactly how much grass is out there, how much the animal needs. We can not overgraze and be able to make those better grazing management plans long term. And again, it's really helping us with that quantifying of loss. So this is the kind of basic steps, and we got pictures on the next slide to show how we are collecting those measurements in field. It's amazing how much good data we get from something that is so simple. Usually if to get that amount of data, we have to work a little harder, but these are really simple. You're going to start by walking across your pasture. You could do the same thing in a hayfield if you were curious. We just tend to use these more in a pasture. In some sort of diagonal or zigzag pattern, just depending on how your farm is set up. It's very much like soil sampling in that we want to make a transect across the field. We don't want to just go in and cherry pick some spots. We want to be very representative. We want to make sure we're taking a height measurement roughly every 10 to 20 steps. And that means something different for everyone. Usually we'll find something that works well for us. I know between just variability of people on my team, if we want a certain distance, for me, I got to take 20 steps. For my student worker, he only has to take 10 because he's 1.5 feet taller than I am. So then the actual number doesn't matter, but you want to be consistent with it. And say, as you're walking across the field, you're taking a measurement every 20th time your right foot lands, and that's where you're going to take the measurement, so that it's letting us be very unbiased in these height readings. We're going to make sure that the stick is stuck right at the bottom of the plant canopy at the soil level. This is relatively easy to do in something like Bermuda grass, just the way the grass lays. We want to be careful in forages like fescue that have a good bunch at the bottom to make sure that we're not hitting the bunch. We are actually at the soil surface, or else it's going to make the grass look actually shorter than what it is if that stick is raised up. We'll place our hand on the stick where the top of the canopy meets, and that's going to be our height reading. And that makes more sense in the picture on the next slide. We just write down the height number and we keep going. So to put that into pictures, because I think better in pictures than words. Once we get to that set point, we'll put the grazing stick down, and you can see we've kind of leveled off here for where it will be. We don't want to push down on that grass, and I have an example in a minute of what that looks like. We would call this an unsupported canopy height, which means we're not going to stretch those leaves up to their maximum height, especially as the little flag leaves start to fall over. We're not going to pull those up because that artificially adds height to it, and we're not going to press it down. That's a different type of measurement. So this would be an unsupported canopy height. Make sure that we're all the way down on the ground and record those numbers. We use these little notepads in my program, mostly because I ordered a bunch of them when I started, and they were the wrong size for what we actually needed for a project, and I still have like 30 of them. So we keep using them for stuff like this. You can do the same thing with a little pocket notebook. If you are more of a technology person, you can record the numbers on your phone. It doesn't really matter. We just want a list of random heights from across the field, so that when we get back to our computer, we can do the math there. So some things that we don't want to do. One is it's really easy when you're walking, especially if it's been a long day and your back's starting to hurt a little bit. It's really tempting to lean that grazing stick over so that it's easier to read the measurements on it, which means if you're pulling it too far one way or the other, you're changing that height number. And so we want it straight up, perpendicular to the ground. Again, we also don't want to press all the grass down to try to make an even number. I've heard producers say, well, I just want it to be even across. But when we start compressing that height, that changes calculations. And so that's measuring something else. And so it's okay that it's variable within an area. That's why we are collecting multiple readings across the entire field so that variability will work itself out. So I'm going to switch files here. Give me just a second. So if you go to our Georgia Forages webpage, here on the main page, it's going to be linked here, and the link currently works. But what is really helpful, it is available for you now, is what we're calling a grazing workbook. And this may change over time, but it has more than what we need for this presentation, but I did put it all together. When you download it, it's a very straightforward Excel file. You can look through the instructions. It will take you through instructions on each of them for building kind of a grazing forecast plan on your farm. And so it's something to just kind of play around with. It's not perfect. It's a work in progress. But what we're going to work on here are these that are here in blue. And it's the grazing stick calculator. And so the new grazing sticks that we had printed for our county agents don't have the calculations on them like the old ones did. So if you have an old grazing stick from NRCS or one of our old events, there's a bunch of very tiny calculations on there that nobody could really read. And everybody complained that they wanted more rulers on the stick until I did that and took the calculations off. And now everybody wants the calculations on the stick again. We can't have the best of both worlds, unfortunately. And so my compromise with that is we made a calculator on here. And so it's doing all of that math for you. So I'm going to try to make this big in case some of you are on a cell phone watching this. Nearly everything is in a drop-down list. And so we're going to, our most common ones that we have calculations for are here. So we're going to say we have a Bermuda grass pasture, that it is average density. There's probably some open areas, but it's relatively good coverage. We're managing under rotational grazing. We're going to say we've got 10 cows that weigh about 1,000 pounds. If you've ever heard our beef specialist, Walton Stewart, speak, he has a presentation called The Myth of the 1,000-Pound Cow, that no cow actually weighs 1,000 pounds. They're all bigger, smaller, but it works so nice for calculations. We keep using it for examples. With that, we're going to say they're mature beef cows. You could make it be whatever you needed it to, and that we have 10 acres. And so that will come into play in a minute. Again, this would just be information for you on your farm. There's not a right or wrong to any of this. We just want to be representative of what you have. Then down here in step 2 is where we're going to enter all those height readings that you went out and took across the farm. And so I'm going to put in some random numbers here just to show you how this works. You'll probably have, realistically, you probably have a lot that are pretty tight grouping. And then you're going to hit a spot that the cows didn't quite get to last year. You may have a lot of forage in a particular area. And then cows always seem to have their favorite spot. So you're probably going to have some pretty low ones in there too. Generally, you're going to have kind of 10 to 12 readings minimum, depending on how small your field is. But this goes all the way down, I think, to 50 to accommodate larger fields. So you don't have to fill it out all the way to the bottom. If you only took, in this case, I entered 13 numbers, took 13 readings, that is sufficient. So we just want to be representative of the area. So much like soil sampling, when there's not, a specific number of cores that you need to take or anything, this is very much like that. If your field is really variable, and you feel like you need more, take more. It's not costing us anything. We're already out there walking. You can take as many data points as you feel like you need. So over here, it's already done all of the math for you. So you can see, based on our inputs that were on the left-hand side, we know that our beginning grazing height is 9 inches. So the average of all of those numbers that we just entered, it calculated it for us, is 9 inches. Since we said this is a Bermuda grass field, our recommended height for grazing, or stubble height to leave behind for Bermuda grass, is 3 inches. So if we change this to a fescue pasture, it would update that to 4 inches. And so that will automatically change for you, which means for every acre on our farm with, because that leaves us with 6 inches of available forage, we have 1,600 pounds of material out there. And so that's pulling in for you, so you don't have to look it up, our recommended final grazing height and our pounds of forage per inch. And so that's why we have, that's why we're doing all of this on that inch mark. And you can make it as accurate as you want to. I tend to go just to the nearest inch, because I feel that's where I'm most comfortable, or my most comfortable level of accuracy in the field. There's some other information here if you want to kind of keep going with this. These were all calculations that were on that original grazing stick. If you wanted to calculate, and I just realized that is spelled wrong and nobody caught it, but we'll fix that. But calculate the number of days it would take to graze this particular field, assuming, the grass is steadily growing over time as well. Our cows, that we had that number of cows, they're not gaining weight, they're not changing their nutritional demands in any way, whatever it may be, all systems stay. We could keep those cows in there for 48 days under this forage scenario. And then sometimes the question comes in of, how many acres do I need for a set number of days? So let's say we were lucky enough to take a 7-day vacation, and we wanted to put the cows out and be able to leave them on that piece of land for 7 days. And so with that available forage, and we know how much the cows need to eat based on those inputs, we would need roughly 1 acre for those 7 days. Again, forages grow constantly. It's an ever-changing system. And so this would be something we would want to, we could go in and do weekly. However often you're rotating your animals, it's not kind of a set time that's going to work for everyone. We also put in this file, which is far too big to see unless you're downloading it on your computer, to where if you wanted to manage this over time for an entire year, you could go in and enter all of that information. You can bring your animal information in as well, and it actually works itself over to say we're going to run into a forage deficit, and we need to start thinking about feeding hay or grain or something to help supplement that. Or if it all checks out, it'll say we're good to go, keep grazing. So again, we'll probably change this multiple times over the upcoming year, because I finished this pretty late in the summer last year, so nobody's really played around with it yet. So don't be surprised that, as we start to get feedback on this and what's working for producers or not working, you may see this file change slightly online. Again, you could create this yourself. It's all the calculations that were on the original grazing stick. But what we ran into is a lot of people couldn't read those, or didn't have the knowledge for how to get that into a form like Excel, that they could go in and quickly edit that. So that's why we made that. Do we have questions on the grazing stick part before we move on?
I was wondering for Bahia, you know how sometimes the seed head shoots way up above the rest of the canopy. So you would measure at the bottom
We would
or
not count the seed head in the case of
right.
Bahia. Almost every time someone in the southern part of the state asks that, because yeah, you can have 3 inches of Bahia forage out there and a 3 foot tall seed head. So we're going to talk about hay sampling first, and then tissue sampling at the end, because there's not a whole lot to talk about there. So when we talk about taking a forage sample, probably the biggest challenge that I see out there, or like question that comes to me, is do I have to have a hay core? And unfortunately, yes, that is how we have to take those forage samples. It doesn't mean you as a producer need to go buy one, though. The vast majority of our county offices within Extension have them available. And if that county office doesn't, usually a neighboring one does. If you really want a hay core, great. The problem is they're fairly expensive. They're a couple $100s, and it's not something that we use daily. So in my mind, it's fine to share. If you had 5 or 6 people that all lived in the same area and wanted to go in on one, that's fine. But we do have to have a hay core of some kind. I prefer the drill assisted ones. That works very well for me. They all, at the end of the day, collect the same sample. And the reason we need the hay core versus just going out and grabbing hay from various parts on the outside of the bale is that core lets us go in and go across multiple windrow locations. So much like zigzagging across a field for taking those forage height readings or soil samples, this is letting us zigzag through those windrows once it's in that bale form. We need to pull 10 to 15 cores for every sample, and we want to have a sample per lot of hay. And so that is hay that was managed the same way, harvested exact same way on the same day. Part of it didn't get rained on, like stuff like that. So just like soil sampling, we take as many hay samples as we need. If you're buying hay, if there's not a forage report attached to it, unfortunately, most of the time there's not, then we would want to sample each load of hay that we're buying and bringing in. A lot of times, if we're doing small squares, it can be a challenge to get enough sample. So you may end up sampling, nearly every bale just to get that good kind of quart size bag that we need to send to the lab. So most of the producers that I work with will use the UGA lab. It's no different than any other lab. If you have a private lab or a lab in another state that you want to work with, that's fine. Some of the numbers may be reported a little differently. And so if you're trying to use UGA recommendations, the numbers may not line up, especially on something like nitrates. So we'll talk about that specifically when we get there. If we are using the UGA lab, the most common one that I work with for beef production, we're going to use F2. There are other sample options available depending on specifically what you want to test, but this was the one that covers 95% of the situations in which I'm consulting with someone on. So we're going to break this report down into 3 different parts. So your information's there at the beginning. You'll have a set lab number. Our test that we're running is there at the top. All of this information here on the left is what was filled in on your sample submission form. And so it's our crop information and the animal information, and that can affect some of the results. We want to be as specific with that as possible, especially with the crop use, to make sure that is marked clearly if it is hay or silage/baleage, because those have 2 different prediction equations used for the NIR analysis. On the right-hand side is our bigger calculations. So the RFQ, or the relative forage quality, and dry matter intake. It's surprising that they are at the top of the report, for me anyway, and not the bottom, just because these are calculations that bring in a lot of different parameters into one index. And so everyone tends to just linearly think that, oh, that's at the bottom, and they miss them up here at the top. We're not using these in terms of diet formulation or making feeding decisions, but they do, especially the relative forage quality. It helps us rank the forages that we have to give it kind of a 1, 2, 3 placement, to know what is objectively our highest quality, mid quality, lowest quality that we have out there. So we don't have specific metrics or anything on those. It puts everything on a level playing field. When we get down to the body of the report, it can be very daunting because there's a lot of information here. But what we're going to be looking at is the data in that dry matter column. For the most part, that's where we're going to stay for this entire section. Over on the left side, the most important ones that we're usually looking at is the protein value and our fiber components. We have NDF and ADF. Those give us kind of a feel for how mature that forage was when it was harvested, and how digestible it's going to be. Now, digestibility is on here. It's not one that we often look at first, but it is here. Usually if we're determining energy of the forage, we're looking for beef cattle anyway. We're looking at that total digestible nutrients that you see on there, again, in that dry matter column. And there's some general metrics out there for what is good and not good, but it's really with respect to the type of animal that you're feeding. And usually when you're making that call, you're going to be working with one of our animal specialists specifically to help narrow that down. Now, where we will start looking at the as sampled is here at the bottom with the moisture and the dry matter. Again, it doesn't necessarily change our feeding decisions directly, but if we're worried about potential mold issues, we're going to look at those numbers. In the case of baleage and silage production, it has to be within a very specific moisture range to ensure good fermentation. And so if I got a baleage sample, and I think I have some examples in here to show, but that were outside of that range, then we're going to be asking questions about, did the fermentation happen successfully, and do we need to do follow-up analyses on that? So down at the bottom of the report is where our nitrates are. This can occur anytime the plant is extremely stressed. I would say our warm season forages are much more likely to accumulate nitrates than the cool season, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible. So usually if we have excessive fertilization, we get a little drought stress, especially in the summer. That's when we start seeing this come up. So it's a really cheap thing to add on to a test if you're doing something else that doesn't automatically include nitrates. It's like $5. And so I always like it as an assurance, because if an animal dies later on, the first thing I'm going to ask is, did you test the forage and did you test for nitrates? So I like to have this up front. Again, we're looking there at that dry matter column because it directly aligns with our UGA recommendations that you see here. Now, I get a lot of calls that say, "Oh, well, my nitrates are 1,000. That got to be unsafe." The problem is that we get used to seeing numbers that are small and under 100 for literally everything else on that report that we just went through. Whereas those nitrate numbers, where they are measured in parts per million, it's actually a pretty big number. And so we consider anything up to 4,500 parts per million completely safe to feed, as long as the animal has good food and water access. Now, where this really comes into play is if you have nitrates tested elsewhere, they may not report them in the same values that we do. And there's ways to convert that to make it line up with our recommendations, but that is something to be aware of, that you can't just directly hold your report next to our recommendation and line it up. And so it's kind of hit or miss around the Southeast as to which way they do this. So do be aware of that you may have to do a little math to go directly from this number here to our recommendation. So yeah, I did slide these in here. So a couple of kind of problematic examples. I use these in a recent agent training. I get a lot of reports that are sent to me, and it's like, hey, is this any good? And as you all have probably heard, you've probably heard me say it before if you've listened to me in another talk. It's one of those, it depends. This hay, it's not terrible for some dry mama cows. However, this report is being asked for lactating cows. And so lactating cows have some of the highest energy demands that of our cattle classes of livestock. And so for that, as a general rule, that total digestible nutrients needs to be 60 to 65% minimum for those lactating cows. Again, it's dependent on her age, her body weight, and those factors that you can work with an animal scientist on. But a 50% TDN is going to be far too low for that lactating animal. And so that's kind of a red flag for this particular sample for how it is being used. Here's another very similar example, except for across the board, there's a lot of things that start sticking out. Our protein is fairly low, considering again that this is for lactating cows. Our digestibility is fairly low, seeing as that cow needs to be turning over those nutrients fairly quickly. And our TDN is actually below what we would recommend ever offering an animal. Usually that 48% is our cutoff. It starts to almost be considered straw after that point. But a big issue that I have with this sample, aside from all of that, because you could out supplement the rest of that if you had to, is that moisture level on this particular sample is 25%. And yes, we live in South Georgia here, and for a lot of us, and I think all these samples actually came from South Georgia. It's hot, it's humid, and so yeah, there's likelihood that you pulled that sample, it's going to get a little extra moisture in it, sending to the lab. However, 25% is a lot. And so when I see a report like this come in, I'm going to ask the question of, are you seeing mold? Does that hay smell musty? Is there something else going on out there? Because that is well above where we recommend hay be baled at. And so what's going on here? And let's start trying to troubleshoot that. I think this is the last report that I have in here. Again, it's for lactating cows, because that tends to be when we have a lot of these issues come up. It's oh, excuse me. The protein's not terrible. I wish it was a touch higher. The TDN is not terrible. Again, I wish it was a touch higher. This was actually one that was sent back and recoded, because this should say baleage or silage, not hay. And the problem with this particular sample is that moisture level is 35%. And we need that to be 40 to 60% for a baleage sample or a baled silage sample. And so when I see them come in and that moisture is too low, it makes me start to question, did that product ferment, and did it ferment correctly? Often a sample like this is going to come in and the agent's going to be telling me, oh, we have this kind of rotten fish smell. It smells like ammonia. Like there's something else that's attached to that. And that's what we start being able or needing to hone in on our fermentation profiles. And so this isn't something that we have historically recommended. It's been kind of a special case scenario. However, in talking with my colleagues in Kentucky, we did a big survey on this. It's becoming a really good tool for our producers. when they call their agent and say, hey, I just don't know if my baleage or silage worked right. And I want to be sure before I start feeding. That's where this fermentation testing is coming in. So we have options available at our UGA lab. It doesn't matter which lab you use, but we do need tests for lactic acid, acetic acid, and pH. We're going to take them much the same way as a hay sample, but we do need to ship them out early in the week, because it is a wetter material, so that we can avoid shipping delays and it can get to the lab quickly. To know it, we do have better thresholds for these, but they're still somewhat variable. Generally speaking, the lactic acid needs to be the dominant acid present in that profile. Acetic acid needs to be fairly minor, and then butyric acid, some labs will report that, not always, needs to be low or non-existent. If you have some really foul smelling baleage or silage, odds are that butyric acid is really high. Ideally, our pH is as low as possible. It does need to be at below 5 in the vast majority of cases. Some forages will ferment better than others and really drop that pH quickly. Others, because of the buffering capacity, you just can't get down as low. But the reason that this fermentation works is because it is in an acidic environment. And so we want to make sure that we're getting that acidity there. Another question that comes up a lot this time of year is when we have molds in the feeds or the hay, what is kind of our action level? And again, a lot of labs can test for molds. You can do it as total aflatoxins or mycotoxins, depending on how it's worded. But the FDA says we have a fairly low action level there for our dairy cattle and our young animals. And then above that, beef cattle are a little more tolerant. And then the stocker animals are going to be a little more tolerant than that. So again, not something that we're going to be testing often, but we do have these available. If you ever do call your county agent and say, hey, I'm worried about molds, then we can look into this. The way that would be reported on it, so again, this looks much like every other report that we've seen. They just added in down here. So any other analysis that we want added to it, it's all going to be added down there at the bottom. And so they just report it down here with that parts per billion. So the last one here is fairly quick, just because there's not a lot of out there on tissue sampling. When you go out, we want to make sure we're testing 40 to 50 locations around the field. Each crop is a little different, and so you can find those online if you need to know specifically. But generally for our grasses, we're going to test prior to seed head development, and legumes at that 10% bloom. We want to make sure that we're sampling the top 6 inches of the plant. And so a really good kind of rule of thumb here is if you grab that plant like what you see in the picture, your hand is roughly 3 to 4 inches across, and then by the time you add your thumb and put your thumb at the top of the plant, you're safely in that 6-inch mark. You'll cut, like I said, 40 to 50 handfuls from around the field. Put them in an open paper bag and just let them kind of air dry before you put them in the box to ship. We don't want to put it in a tight plastic bag because they're just going to sit and essentially rot on the way to the lab. Oops. If we're testing for nutrient or for the tissue samples in forages, we're doing it to detect a deficiency. There are other crops that will use it to make fertilizer decisions and so on. That's not what we're doing. We're usually saying, hey, half this field doesn't look so great and the other half seems to be doing well. What's going on? And so if we're looking for nutrient deficiencies, also collect your soil samples at the same time. Because sometimes there's things in the soil that just don't make it to the plant. And so we want to be able to rule those out. We have just a basic plant test available through the lab with those nutrients. Again, it's nothing special. You could get a very similar package at a lot of labs. Now, in terms of what is good and not good with these, there's not as clear-cut recommendations for them. These are all coming from our Ag Science Lab up in Athens. You may hear it called the Ag Environmental Science Lab or the UGA FVSU Lab. There are a couple different names for it, but they have online an extremely detailed plant analysis handbook. And the reason for that is every crop is a little different. And so you can find the specific recommendations for your crop if you do need to test this. Most of ours are going to come under this hybrid Bermuda grass. And it should show you that it's not been updated in a while because, again, it doesn't really change. But Tipton 85 isn't even on that list. So this research was done a long time ago. It'll tell you for each crop what plant part and when you need to take it. And then once you get that report, it has the general ranges for what we expect kind of a sufficient value to be. And then some notes on it to the side. Again, a lot of that should be kind of auto-generated, but if you're just curious, here is that information. If you want to kind of see how you're walking across and using that grazing stick and walking through the calculations by hand, if you'd rather do them that way, we have a video on that on our YouTube channel. So if you just do Georgia Forages on YouTube, it should pop right up. I know I also have a hay testing video on there that shows every hay probe that I have here in my program. There are more out there. I use the ones that I think there was 4 or 5 of them in that video to kind of give you a good range for what these different probes look like. And then we also had one for tissue sampling. I think it might be looped in that hay sampling one if you want to just kind of see what it looks like to go out and collect that sample in the field to ship it off. All right. Again, we already talked about this a little bit. Each of these summarize all the information that we have on our website into one place, so you don't have to download 20 different extension bulletins to get kind of the complete story for these main forage systems that we have. All right, so with that, I am free to take any questions. I see one that's popped up. The Excel file is on our Georgia Forages webpage.
I guess if you wanted to not just test your hay, but you can also sample your plant tissue and test the quality of your pastures as well, right? So
Yeah.
so you could take some. Do you recommend taking those fresh pasture samples and then drying it down before you send them in?
They at least need to wilt down before you go. And usually if I have a fresh sample like that, I like to overnight it and just get it there. So I don't have to worry about it. And that may just be the unreliability of my postal service that I have access to here. But I prefer to just overnight them and get them up there. The challenge with testing the fresh forage is usually if we're testing, we're wanting to graze now. By the time you collect that sample and send it in and get a response back, it may be a week or more later. And as that grass is maturing, our quality is steadily declining. And so the sample may not be as representative as it could be, just depending on lab times. Yeah, so there is a question here on the relationship between NDF and ADF with the quality. In general, we want those numbers to be as low as possible for what I'm working with. You can hit a point where they're probably too low in some scenarios, but generally speaking, we want them to be as low as possible. Our cool season forages are generally going to be lower fiber content than our warm season just because of the way the cell walls are made up and the environment in which they're growing. And so there's kind of a lower threshold on where something like Bermuda grass could feasibly get to. But if you're looking at 2 Bermuda grass samples, one that was cut on time versus one that was cut over mature, the over mature one is going to have the higher ADF and NDF values every time. And that's going to translate to a lower dry matter intake and lower digestibility.
Don't they use, or do they use, the NDF or ADF in the relative forage quality calculation?
Not directly. It actually goes into the TDN equation, and then that feeds in to the RFQ equation. And so that's why the RFQ is nice, because it brings in all those different metrics that we looked at and puts it in one value for us. It would be great if we could make the feeding decisions then on that one value. We're not there yet, but it helps to put everything on a level playing field so that we're comparing apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. Because when you start looking at all those numbers, you may have one that's higher protein, one that was more digestible. You're going to have, one with higher fiber, one with lower lignin, whatever it may be. And so it's nice to be able to pull all of those metrics into one for just a quick reference when we're deciding which hay to go feed first. Now, if you're sending samples to some of the big national labs, they may report back something called RFV, or relative feed value. That one is not very useful for us because it was developed more on the grain side, and it doesn't account for the true digestibility of forages. And so it'll actually make things kind of look better or worse than what they truly are, usually worse than what they actually are. Because of that slower digestibility of the forages. And there's not a way to directly change an RFV value to RFQ. Again, it's not the end of the world, but do recognize that if they look so similar in how they're reported, but they do mean different things. Again, you're not really going to encounter that within the state of Georgia, but there are some of the big national labs that are servicing a broader customer base with a lot of different products will still report RFV.
So I just have a real simple question as far as even for some of our either non-farmers or just newer farmers in reference to short-term and long-term advantages of getting this information. Like, why would I want to use my grazing stick, which I covered detailed, but as far as like big picture.
Yeah, so big picture, it helps you set realistic grazing goals on your farm, to know how much grass is out there, because I do this myself in the hayfield. I walk out and I'm like, oh, I'm going to get the best harvest ever. And we actually start measuring, and then I start bailing, and it's like, oh, it wasn't actually as great as what I thought it was. And so it helps put things, it takes our bias out of making those decisions and to put pen to paper. It's not perfect. We're always trying to improve upon that. But even the best technology out there, the grazing stick's pretty hard to beat, just because forage height works so well on an inch by inch metric. And so if you're relatively new to farming and you don't have kind of those points of reference yet, for, I know if it's boot high, I can keep cows out here this long or whatever. It's helping you kind of build that foundation, and not having to learn the hard way. If one kind of cool way to measure ground coverage now, that's available on your phone, it's an app called Canopy O. I think it's like Canopy, and then they took the Y off and put O. You just take a picture of you hold it out, take a picture, and it'll measure green grass cover. So that's I don't know, it's been out about 10 years now. We haven't been able we've got other things that we'll do from the research side, but on the producer side, that's a very effective tool to just say, do I have 30% ground cover? Or do I have 70% ground cover? And last I checked, it was still a free download through Oklahoma State. There's probably others out there now. As soon as you get one useful app for something, 10 other people make the same thing. So you may encounter others as well, but that was kind of the first one that really took off and had some clout behind it.
Bermuda grasses, we're experiencing a lot of stem maggots. Or that's going to be a challenge for us these days.
It has been a challenge for a long time, and so if you're just now seeing it, it means your neighbors are doing a really good job of controlling it, and that they've shifted their population to you. If it's never been to a level that you've noticed before, it's a challenge to control in pastures, because of the timing of the insecticide applications. but if you search online, it's called Managing Bermuda Grass Stem Maggots. It's our UGA Extension bulletin on it. It will tell you everything you ever wanted to know about it that we currently have available. There is a new production guide it's in press right now related to that. And as soon as that becomes available, it'll be pushed out on our social media and put on our website as well. It's not vastly different. The core recommendation is still the same. It just tells you a little more on the research that we've done since then. And so that is in press now. So I'm still waiting for it to be published. But it's called, the one that's currently available is called Managing Bermuda Grass Stem Maggots. Thank y'all and hope you enjoy your evening.